morning, everyone. Glad to see everyone this morning. We have quite a few visitors. We have a lot of new faces, and there's a lot of events going on today. In light of the rain, I like to think of right now pretty much a blessing of rain that's coming down upon us. It's good for the earth. It also means there's some cold days ahead of us, but it'd be nice if it just stayed warm, wouldn't it? It's good to see William and Barbara. Okay, I was about to say Bonnie, but that's not it. So William and Barbara, fun fact, they are the better part of Bonnie Fowler. She'll be here in a little while, but if you can get to meet them, they're related to Bonnie and David. And I know we've heard some really good things about Barbara, and I've been really looking forward to meeting William a lot. We also have the Elliots with us this morning. We don't have just Rip this morning. We also have Paul with us, and we're glad that they can be here, even though Kathy not being here kind of teeters the scale a little bit. But we're glad to see them. Also, Marilyn. Yes, Marilyn is with us. She just recently moved into the area. She was living over in the Fall Branch area, but she'll be coming here for hopefully a long while. I've been excited for this the past couple of months since I've heard about this. So lots of good stuff today. We've got potluck coming on later today, the fellowship meal. There's going to be people kind of pouring in because this is normally how potluck days typically work. Everybody falls late for some reason, but that's okay. We can work with that. Let's go ahead, begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll talk about how we're going to work through our study for this new study that we're starting this morning. We'll ask Brother David Hicks if he can lead us in prayer. Amen. Okay, the next 13 weeks we're going to be looking through a study on where Jesus walked. There are so many different places that Jesus went in his lifetime, and when you look at the land of Palestine, I believe some people have equated it with pretty much being the size of Rhode Island. It's less than 100 miles that Jesus went through in his lifetime. Not that he walked less than 100 miles, but in terms of distance from where he was born and the region that he stayed within, he didn't really go that far. Even though as we read through the gospel accounts, it seemed like he went all over the world. Well, his ministry was very localized, and that's what we're going to be studying the next 13 weeks. Now, next week I'll be gone. We'll have a guest speaker next week, but for the most part, we'll be looking through different places that are common places that we read about through the life of Jesus. And this morning, as we go through Lesson 1, we're going to talk about a place by the name of Bethany. So if you want to open to Lesson 1, you can do that. If you'd rather turn open to Luke chapter 10, verse 38, that's where we're going to begin at least our scripture reading for this morning. If we talk about the name Bethany, can anybody tell me any events that they may know of maybe occurred in Bethany or around Bethany? You can phone a friend too. You can't use those. Yeah, there are at least three that we know of. We're going to talk about three of those from Luke 10, John 10 a little bit, and then also Luke 24. Mary and Martha, yes. Now, when we're talking about Mary and Martha, which Mary and Martha are we talking about? Because there's a lot of Marys in the life of Jesus. Huh? Yes, they were Lazarus' sisters. So one of the, I said John 10. John 11, one of the things we're going to read is one of the accounts that we had talked about last Sunday during the morning sermon, looking at the death of Lazarus, but also the resurrection of Lazarus. And we're going to see a few things that we can pull from Martha and how we can apply it to Jesus. That's very good. Any other events? Christ's ascension? Yes, actually it would tell us that he went out into a place in Galilee, but we do find that in the beginning of Acts chapter 1, we do find that that is the same location where Jesus would have risen. I found it very fitting because that's where another man was risen, but we'll talk about that here in a moment. Anything else? Okay, that's good for now. Okay, so if we're talking about the place Bethany, if we're looking through the New Testament, if we read the word Beth, normally we think that is a very beautiful girl's name or a lady's name, and rightfully so. But in the Hebrew, the word for Beth means house. This particular place of a house would be one that is a house near the region of Jordan. You look at John chapter 1, verse 28, and you'll find that Bethany was located right on that spot, right before you cross over into Jordan. But it's a little bit south of the city of Jerusalem, just a couple of miles away from Jerusalem. So as we're reading through the book of John and we find Jesus about chapter 10, coming towards the last couple weeks of his ministry, and then we get to John chapter 11, where he goes to Bethany. There's a reason why the disciples were saying, Lord, if you go there, they're going to kill you, because he had already stirred up the hornet's nest, so to speak. But Jesus knew that's where his mission would lead him. The people that he loved most, which we'll find out in this morning's lesson during the worship assembly, the people that Jesus loved most seem to be the very people that gave Jesus the most resistance. And you think about how you in your own service for the Lord, when you try to reach out to family members, why is it that it's the hardest to try to convert those at home as opposed to trying to convert someone who's not even related to your family? That kind of seems opposite of how we would expect things to work. But Jesus knew that, and Jesus loved his hometown, he loved his family, he loved his own people so much that John 1 would tell us he was the light of men. And the darkness did not comprehend it. Though he came to his own creation, they rejected him, and ultimately they crucified him. But God knew that would be the plan all along, that he would come to redeem mankind, but his own creation would reject him. Well, Bethany has a couple of good stories in it that I think if we cherish those things that we find Jesus walking through and doing in our lesson this morning, we'll find that we too can find ourselves being very blessed that we visit Bethany this morning. So I would invite you, open up to Luke chapter 10. And I want us to begin in verse number 38. Luke 10, beginning in verse 38. Now, even though the book does not talk about this, I find it important that in Luke 10, there are technically two different types of, we call them limited commissions. There is the sending out of the 12, where Jesus would send them out in groups of 2. But then in Luke chapter 10, we find out the sending out of the 70. And there were probably more disciples that were with those who were called the apostles. In fact, if you look in Acts chapter 1, and you find that they're trying to fill the office position of Judas, it tells us, I believe, there were about 120 individuals who were disciples of Jesus, going along with Jesus. And there were 2 individuals who had been with Jesus from his baptism in Jordan all the way to his crucifixion. And that's where we have Barsabbas and we have Matthias. And Matthias was the individual who was chosen to fill the spot of Judas, which tells me that when we find the sending out of the 70, there was more than just 12 men who were devoted to Jesus. The reason the gospel writers focus on the apostles is because this is who the New Testament canon will be carried on through the writings of the apostles. Now, in the midst of the sending out of the 70, you have all this work taking place. People are going out, they're healing the sick, they're trying to take care of those who are poor, and they're basically doing everything that Jesus could do, but they're going out in twos. In that context of doing good for others, we also read in Luke chapter 10 the parable of the Good Samaritan. where those who we would expect would be first up to bat to help people, the Levites wanted nothing to do with the battered man who was on the road. The priest wanted nothing to do with the man who was battered on the road. But it was a Samaritan, those who were despised by what the people of that day would say, this is what true religion looks like. Well, Jesus was trying to show them those who claimed to be truly religious were the very ones who were guilty of forgetting and forbidding or foregoing what God had commanded. So in the parable of the Good Samaritan, we find sending out people to go do the work. Sometimes that help will be found in people whom you least expected. But then another problem arises. Jesus sends out 70 to go do the work that he would also do, but to help in that work. We find that not everyone who should be expected to do the work is going to do the work. And then we find a third side of Luke chapter 10, in which we find in our text, verse 38 through 42. We're introduced to two women, one by the name of Mary and the other by Martha. We'll go ahead and read the text, and we'll break apart the text a little bit. It happened as he went, he entered into a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she approached him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore tell her to help me. And Jesus answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things, but one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen the good part, which will not be taken away from her. The book wants to focus on this aspect of hospitality towards Jesus. True or false, it is good to serve others. That's true. That's just a general principle. If you love your fellow man as you do yourself, you'll love them, as Jesus would say, serve one another or love one another just as I have loved you. That love we tend to put into very close circles, but that's not what we're finding here. True or false, one must always put service before listening to God. That's false. Context of the situation is going to determine that. There is an idea in younger generations that we're not doing enough. And some of that rebellion or that argumentation can be true to an extent. But if all we do is serve, and we never listen to Jesus, what's going to happen eventually? Or what may start from the very beginning? So though there's nothing wrong with the idea of service towards others, we do need to have that faith with works, James 2, but it needs to be a mixture of both. I can't know how I am to serve and the attitude I need to have when I'm serving others if I don't turn first to the master servant. In fact, if you look at Isaiah chapter 53, it calls him the suffering servant in Isaiah's text. It's important for us to know what God expects of us, even when God expects us to do good things for others. But there are times where Jesus says, this is not the time to serve. I'm reminded of an event in the book of Joshua, where Joshua and the Israelites would go, and after they had conquered Jericho, they're on this spiritual high of sorts, and they presume, because they've taken over this massive city that had these huge fortified walls, that when they went to go take over the city of Ai, they presumed that because God was with us before, He'll always be with us. Essentially, in the Israelites' mind, once victorious, always victorious. And that's true to an extent. But something happened when they plundered Ai, or they tried to plunder Ai. What happened in their first attempt? Achan. I like to think of the Billy Ray Cyrus, my aching, breaking heart. I know that's not how the song title is, but it flows. Achan had stolen some of the cursed thing that God said to utterly destroy. And Joshua's response is interesting, and God's response to Joshua is interesting as well. If things go wrong in life, what do we typically do because we trust in God? Well, okay, so some people do blame God. What's that called when we're talking to him? Y'all are giving me a piece of my own medicine today. I'm not appreciating it. What's that called when one talks with God? Prayer. Do you know what God told Joshua? Get up off your knees. This is not the time to pray. There is sin in the camp. Go take care of the sin. Then go back and take care of Ai. There are times where, though good intentions can be behind it, it's not good to serve. It's better to listen. Hear what the Master has to say. In fact, notice what Jesus says about this before we're quick to criticize what Jesus would say. I think it's interesting in verse number 40. It uses this word. They came to the house. She had a sister named Mary. Verse 39, sat at the feet of Jesus, heard his word. But Martha was, notice the word, distracted with much serving. Quite literally, in the Greek, it's almost similar to the word we use for perspective. Her periscope was askew because she was so distracted with wanting to serve Jesus that she was forgetting the even better part, that Jesus' teaching was the meal. That was the main course for that setting. And Martha was not getting that. In fact, when you notice how it amplifies the idea, her periscope, her perspective was not only skewed, but notice the word much serving. It would be one thing if she served Jesus and took care of maybe a couple of customary things because you have a visitor coming to your house. You want your house to look good. I mean, you want it prepared for your guests. You're about to open your home to them, so you want to show the best hospitality that you can. But with much serving, sometimes we can go overkill to try to tend to those who are with us. And this text is not saying do as much as you can for those whom you're trying to serve, but what it is saying is what Jesus tells us in verse 41 and 42. Martha, you're worried. You're troubled about many things. Now, he doesn't say you're troubled about serving. Many things. In one regard, she's worried about taking care of Jesus, but also in another regard, she's more focused on what Mary is doing rather than what she herself is doing. She's confusing the concept of what devotion for God requires, and that is, verse 42, one thing is needed. Hear Jesus. I find it of interest as well if you look at Matthew chapter 17. I know this one isn't Bethany, but we'll get to the Mount of Transfiguration at some point. When you look at Matthew 17 and you see Jesus is there, it would tell us that his visage or his personage became like glowing lights, basically the sun glistening. And there were two other people that Peter, James, and John saw. One was Moses, the other Elijah, I believe. But both of those figures were also glistening. And what did Peter say about this image before him? What did he say to Jesus? It's good for us to be here. Let's make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, the other Elijah. Well, God the Father did not like that. And God simply came in a cloud of glory, so to speak, and he said, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." And the text would tell us that Peter was afraid. He hid his eyes. And I think intentionally the Holy Spirit did this in penning the text. It would say that Peter looked up and he only saw Jesus. Peter had the idea of wanting to serve Jesus even more, but that was not his place to serve Jesus in that way. The best thing that we can do when it comes to serving our Lord is first off listen to the Master to see what he says we must do in order to serve others acceptably. We could look at John 13. We could look at the washing of the feet, which is really the key text to look at if we want to know how we are to show service to other people. But you find even in that text, it's good in that text not just to listen to the Master, but also live after what the Master is doing in that text. You see that I, your teacher, have washed your feet. If you are my servants, and I am your master, and I washed your feet, what are you to do for others? Jesus is showing there is a time where you can intermingle both service and a sincere desire to listen to the master at the same time. But what we find in Luke chapter 10, hospitality is good, but if we fail to listen to Jesus, then all of that's going to be pretty much for nothing. It'll be overkill, we'll worry ourselves to death, and we'll lose the one thing that Jesus would say in verse 42, this is the one thing that is needed. If we fail to choose the good part, then we're going to be constantly worried about a lot of different things. Does anybody know what Jesus would say in light of Matthew chapter 6? Consider the lilies of the field. They toil not, neither do they spin. Even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed so much as a flower, which I find interesting because Solomon's net worth was billions of billions, close to trillions of dollars. And Jesus would say all those billions of trillions of dollars have nothing on the beauty of a flower. And they're not even worried or anxious. Now, if the sparrows of the field, if your Father in heaven takes care of them, or if He clothes the grass of the field daily so that it's not lacking in anything, why are you so anxious over your daily provisions? What does Jesus say about the troubles of today? The worries of today are sufficient enough. Tomorrow has its own worries. Now, Jesus isn't saying don't plan for things, but what He is saying is that sometimes we become so consumed with a different time and a different place and a lot of hypotheticals and what ifs that Jesus says, why don't you take the thing that cannot be taken from you? Your sleep can be taken from you because of how anxious and worried you are. Your service can also be taken from you and people not appreciate it as much as it could be appreciated. But if we put Jesus in His proper place and we serve Jesus as well in the proper place, we'll find ourselves being hospitable to others and service to others in a way that God intended. So when I look in Luke chapter 10, I find first off that when Jesus went to Bethany, it was a lesson on learn to listen to know how to serve. When you do that, then you will find what God truly desires for you. Any comments before we go to our second event in Bethany? That's good. Yeah, and it's having the maturity and the knowledge of knowing when is the appropriate time to do something as opposed to not. This is where I was talking to a guy the other day. The golden text of our generation today, for some reason, seems to be Matthew 7. Oh, you can't judge me. You can't judge me. But then I go to John chapter 7, verse 24, and Jesus would say, judge righteous judgment, not according to the appearance. Well, Jesus said I'm supposed to judge, but then you turn around and say that I can't judge. The idea is maturity, knowing when to do something, when not to do something. And all Jesus is saying in Matthew 7 is, be fair with other people. If you're fair with them, God will judge you according to the same policies. If you're unfair towards people, then God will also hold you accountable to your unfair standard. So treat others as you would like to. That's the concept of Matthew 7, but you're absolutely right. Jesus does tell us we do need to be mindful of things, but in the proper manner. And if you dive further down that rabbit hole, like too much, and dwell on it too much, then that will cause like long-term things. But that's absolutely right. Knowing the difference of that's key. Good comments. Any other ones? Okay, John chapter 11, we find Jesus returning on the latter end of his ministry. In Luke chapter 10, we find him kind of earlier, some would say somewhere in his first or second year of his ministry. But now we find Jesus coming to the end of his ministry, where he comes back to Bethany. Now, in the book, it does kind of give a very good breakdown of the resurrection. Really, the big thing with this is the approach that we find from Martha in the statement that is made. John chapter 11, sorry, I keep saying 10. John chapter 11, I'll kind of paraphrase a few of these things, but I really want to focus on Martha's conversation with Jesus. So in the beginning of this text, we find after Jesus heals the man who was blind, and the premise of that is that I'm the light of the world. I'm here to give sight to those who are blind. Even some of the Pharisees would say, Lord, are we blind also? Well, if you were blind, then the Son of Man would have no need to come and help you. And the concept was everyone has blinded themselves in some way. But in John chapter 11, we find another one of the last greater miracles of Jesus in his lifetime, the resurrection chapter. When we begin this text, it seems like that Jesus simply doesn't care, but he does care. In fact, in the beginning part of this passage, Jesus explains to us why he responds to the death of Lazarus or the news of the sickness of Lazarus the way that he does. Notice with me, beginning in verse number 1, there was a certain man sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. And it was Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore the sister sent him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. So when Jesus heard that, he said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Consider what's going to happen through this text. I must keep in mind that whatever happens in John chapter 11, Jesus is telling me, this is so that the Son of Man can be glorified in his proper place. So whatever's about to happen, whether it goes the way that we think it's going to go or not, Jesus says, keep this in mind all the way. The disciples didn't get this at first. Verse number 5, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. You get a phone call that someone you love is in the ICU. The doctors are afraid that they're not going to live through the night. And if you follow the pattern of Jesus, you'll wait 2 days before you show up. Actually, more days pass by. Does that sound like love? And that's not the point that Jesus is making in light of timeliness of certain situations that are just uncontrolled aspects of life. Rather, what Jesus is showing, again, keep it within the context that Jesus says, verse 4, this is so that the Son of Man may be glorified. What's more impressive in light of glorifying Jesus? Healing someone who is about to die, or what gives more credibility? Impressive is not the right word. What gives more credibility to the power of Jesus? Someone who's about to die and you take the sickness away from him. Jesus had already done that a lot through his ministry. But what if someone has been dead for quite a few days? So much so that the body begins to decay. So you've got physical deformities. You've got this stench about him. And which one will bring God more glory? The one who's dead, completely dead. And there is no way, at least not from man's perspective, there is no way that he can bring him back to life. So when we see in verse number 8, after Jesus tells them, let's go to Judea again, this is where we find verse 8 through 16. The disciples were kind of weary about this. Now that's not the focus for this text, but we'll come back to this idea. Lord, they're going to kill you if you go there. Well, we're going so that I can wake up Lazarus, who is asleep. And then Jesus has to tell them plainly, in verse number 14, Lazarus is dead, because they thought when he used the word sleep that he just meant that Lazarus was just unconscious in some way. And that's not what he meant. Lazarus is dead, but I'm glad for your sake that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. This is not just for the glory of all who are going to see this miracle performed, but also it was for the belief of the disciples. I find that of interest because even though we have people walking with Jesus, and this is getting to the third year of being with Jesus, there were still some of the apostles who had problems believing that Jesus was the Son of God. That just blows my mind. But then I think through my life, I do the same thing over and over and over again. I go through the same motions, so to speak. What's eventually going to happen if that's my view of how I serve God? It's just something to do. I have no actual emotional connection. If my idea of coming to learn of God, worship before Him, and just be awed and changed and transformed through the power of His Word, if I view God as simply a checkbox, there's no connection that I'm going to want to make with God, because I'll see Him as nothing more than a boss that I work for at Walmart. And if you've ever worked at Walmart, it's not a fair place to work. Maybe some days if things go in your favor, but it's an okay place to work. With God, it's not like that. He's completely different. And what Jesus is trying to emphasize to the apostles is He's trying to emphasize the concept of, okay, how far does the power of God go? We've seen those who are sick. We've seen those who are lame. We've seen those who are mute. We've seen those who are demon-possessed. And even sometimes the spoken word. Think of Jesus out on the sea with the storm on Galilee, and He just said, "Peace, be still." And the power of His voice simply turned nature just like that. Who is this man that God has given man such a wonderful gift? Well, He's the Son of God. But what if He can do something beyond just arresting nature or arresting the health of physicality of things? What if He can do something that no one else has ever done before? Bring someone back from the dead. So now we find Jesus and His disciples, verse 17, coming to the tomb, but notice the timestamp. He had already been in the tomb for 4 days. So at least a week and a half has gone by before Jesus actually responds to the request, "Come see Lazarus, whom you love." 4 days pass by, and we find, who does He find first? The one who is troubled and worried about many things. He meets Martha. Notice in verse number 20, Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, so He's not there yet, but just heard the news, went and met Him. But Mary stayed in the house. Now, how far did she have to go before she met Jesus? I don't know. But the point is that when she heard He was coming, she knew exactly the path He would be taking to get there. We'll come back to that here in a moment. Even though she knew where He would be, her assumption of His motives, notice she begins with an accusation here to begin. Verse number 21, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." It's as if unless Jesus is right next to me and talking to me and being my one-on-one advisor 24/7, bad things are going to happen to me. And some people have that idea, whether it's of a necklace or a charm bracelet or something. They'll wear an icon that they say, "This represents that God is with me." Well, there's a couple of issues with that, but how can I know that God is with me even though God is not physically right next to me? That's what Martha is saying. Lord, had you physically been here, you could have done something. I'm reminded of a man by the name of Jairus who had a daughter who was sick, and Jesus never went to that house upon that request. He started on His way, and then we have the woman with the blood issue, and she came, and because of her, so to speak, Jairus' daughter passed away. But Jesus simply said something, and she was healed. If Jesus has the power to say something and it carries over a matter of distance on earth, What about what Jesus says is possible, and he's sitting in heaven right now, reigning over all things pertaining to what the Father has given him? If he's in heaven right now and he says, if you do this, then this will happen, does his word still have that same kind of power to go from heaven to earth and still have just as much power? Yes, his words transcend distance. It transcends, if you want to call it, planes of realities, if you want to call it that, from the physical world to the eternal world. In this case, we find Martha not only knowing where Jesus was, but in the accusation. I don't think you could have done this if you were there. You would have just said something. And notice verse 22, even now I know that whatever you ask God, God will give you. We talked about last week, her accusation is, it seems like if you just say, God, bring him back, he'll do it. And then when Jesus says something about the resurrection, and that's what he says, your brother will rise again. Martha doesn't look at the immediate timeline, but rather she looks at the end of days. She looks at the resurrection day. And she says, yes, I know in the resurrection he'll return. But that's not what Jesus is going to show her. What he's going to show her is that, do you not think that I can do it even now? And then let's fast forward through the text, because this one's focusing on Martha again. When Jesus says, roll away the stone from the tomb, who comes and gives him the caution, warning, precursor before you watch any video? Martha came back. Martha came back. And she said, oh, Lord, he stinks. Well, it's a matter of hygiene and bringing back my loved one to life. That seems to make sense. But put yourself into Martha's shoes. You are emotionally drained. You have a lot of questions that you're asking about your Lord, who says that he loves you, but then he does this. And he's saying these things like, I'm the resurrection. If you believe, it will be so. And Martha does say, I believe. I believe. But again, she's still thinking way beyond this time. She's not considering the possibility, can he do something about my life now? And he does. In fact, when I look at Jesus and his power over life, notice when he makes this statement in verse number 43. When he said these things, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he who had died came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to him, let him loose and let him go. Verse 45, many of the Jews who had come to Mary had seen the things that Jesus did. They believed in him. But the sadder commentary is verse 46. Some of the people who saw this miracle did not believe in Jesus. What they did was saw it, went to the adversaries of Jesus, told the adversaries of Jesus what Jesus had done, and instead of them believing the deity, the divinity, and the power of Jesus, they sought to kill him even more. Have you ever wanted to kill God because of the great things he does for other people, but not in your life? Well, there is a sense in which we can kill someone and not kill someone. And in John chapter 4, it tells me that if I hate my brother, I've already committed murder in my heart. Not saying that I'm going to be held counsel to the law of the land, but the idea is that the sin of jealousy and envy and hatred towards others is just as grievous as if you had actually killed someone. And when I try to blame God for the things that he does in my life for other people, who am I to say, Lord, had you been here, my life could have been so much better? Well, think about it this way. God is in heaven. He's not here next to us, yet he still takes care of so many other things that we never bat an eye to think about throughout the day. Think about all the people over in Europe, in Africa, in China, Canada, South America. I could never work my life savings to take care of everybody in the world, but somehow God makes that happen. You look at all the animals in all of nature. I can't possibly do that. You put me in charge over a little flower, we're doomed. We're doomed. I just don't have the green thumb. I have the downward green thumb. But that's the point. God is so awesome and he is so powerful, and just the way that he works within the lives of others, why would that provoke me to envy? But when I look at the state of Lazarus, and then we'll make one more point about Martha, how many days can you walk away from God and in an instant God can bring you back just as brand new? And that's the principle that he's bringing out with Lazarus. No matter how long you've been dead with sin, by sin, Jesus can bring you back to life in an instant. And the spiritual lesson that we learn from Lazarus along with this is that Lazarus did not have, at least as far as what the story tells us, the only thing Lazarus did was come out of the tomb. He was sick, he died, and he came out of the tomb. Well, we're sick with sin. We die to the old man, or at least with the old man, to some extent on either a daily basis or something that we struggle through in life. And Jesus still offers the daily, let me resurrect the new man that you are to be, the new creation you are to live like. Let me resurrect him again. But then what if we have the attitude of Martha, Lord, I know you can fix me in the long run, but you can't fix me now. Yes, he can. Yes, he can. And he can fix others around you much faster than sometimes, unfortunately, we may give the benefit of the doubt for others to change in an instant. It reminds me of an account in Mark chapter 5 where there was a demonic man possessed by legion. And at the end of that account, it would say that all those who came and saw the wonders that Jesus did, they saw this man sitting upright, wearing clothes, and of a sound mind, and it terrified the people. Does it scare you in your thought? Think through people you know and love who do not know God. They have not obeyed him. They're not his children. Does it bother you that God may be able to change their life for the better in an instant? Or is that the very aim that we long for? To see them change into the new creation and become God's adored child. There are so many things we can learn from Bethany, and unfortunately we weren't able to get to the ending in Luke 24, but I would encourage you to read The Road to Emmaus and read those who were in Bethany when they saw Jesus ascend into the clouds. Such wonderful lessons, and Lord willing, next week we'll continue looking into the city of bread, Bethlehem, as we look into the life of Jesus. So thank you for your kind attention. We'll be back in about 15 minutes, and then we will begin our morning assembly. Thank you.